we're going to start. This is our spending affordability guidelines for the FY20 operating budget, and we do have here Mr. Smith and Ms. Michelson, and I do want to acknowledge Mr. Sesker, who prepared this packet, and is a major contributor to a lot of our work around this area. But I guess I will turn it over to Mr. Smith.
Certainly.
Walk us through this.
Yes, no, I appreciate that. Pinch hitting for Mr. Sesker today, so appreciative of the work he put into this. So the GO committee is going to make 3 decisions required by the county charter and code today, and then a 4th decision that they normally take up when it comes to grants during this process. So the 3 decisions that the GO committee will be making today that they need to make is setting a ceiling on property tax revenues, setting a ceiling on the aggregate operating budget, and allocating that aggregate operating budget to the different agencies. Before we get to those decisions, I'll go ahead and walk through the packet a little bit about what spending affordability guidelines is and is not. So the decisions that the council is making today is not going to be setting a limit on the recommendations that the executive or other agencies can make to the council when the budget comes over in March. It's also not setting a prediction on what they believe these recommendations are going to look like. It's not an action to ratify any of the numbers that we saw in the fiscal update in December regarding debt service, OPEB, and agency allocations. And it's also not an action to actually set tax rates. So as much as we're going to set a limit today, it's not setting the actual tax rate that the council will make in May. What SAG really is primarily setting a limit in terms of what the council will need in order to pass an operating budget in May to exceed the aggregate operating budget by 7 votes. So whatever the limit is that the GO committee recommends today to the council and what the council ultimately sets next week will be the limit that requires at least 7 votes. And that's primarily kind of the practice we're doing today. So the reason we do this is to for the council to help determine what they believe is an affordable operating budget as we get into the decisions coming in March and April. There's no set limit in terms of what factors the council should consider or what the committee should consider. Council staff has given several items just for your consideration, some related to the economy. And as we talked about in December, a lot of that is still a mixed bag. We've seen growth, but obviously we just came out of a long furlough for our federal workers. We're not sure how that's going to impact the county revenues. Finance is estimating that the personal income has continued to be strong this year, not as strong as they were expecting, but still strong as comparable to previous years. As we talked about on January 22nd, our population continues to grow, but that mix of population is not evenly distributed and it has different levels of services and needs, as we discussed then. So in general, when staff was performing the different ways to figure out what to set the aggregate operating budget at, we decided it was best to just continue to be fiscally prudent in considering those levels.
If I just pause for 1 second. Anybody here from OMB, et cetera, that wants to just join us at the table in case we have questions? It'd be great to just have you guys here as well. Before we continue. And just introduce yourselves again, just for the record as we're proceeding.
Chris Mullen, OMB.
Dennis Hepburn, Finance.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, Mr. Smith, continue.
Sure. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the decision points now, unless there were any questions related to kind of the background and leading up. Okay. So the first decision that we talked about is setting the ceiling on property tax revenue. And again, as I noted, this is not actually setting the tax rate for May. It's just setting the limit or the guideline and the ceiling as we go into SAG. So council staff, as always, recommends that we just set it at the charter limit.
Mm-hmm. Any comments or questions from my colleagues? Any objection to that recommendation? Okay, without objection, we agree.
Okay. The next decision is setting the aggregate operating budget. So I'll ask people to turn to Circle 1, and for those who are either at home or seeing this later, this is the table that shows the different options that council staff conducted in terms of determining kind of what the next, what the level should be. So one option is always just hold the budget steady, which is 0%, which is in the column D. And then there's 4 other options based on either inflation growth, which is column F, inflation and population growth, which is column E. Column F is holding Montgomery County government and park and planning at the level budget from fiscal 19, and then column G is personal income growth. Given the conditions that we talked about briefly before we got into this, staff is recommending column F, with just keeping Montgomery County government and park and planning level for this year, which would be plus 1.43% over the fiscal 19 approved budget. We believe that is a fiscal prudent rather than setting it too high, like such as column G or column E, which is based on other factors. And that would give a total aggregate operating budget of 4.9464 billion. Sorry.
Okay, Councilmember Friedson.
New here, still figuring out the
Doing
microphones. So I just had a couple questions about it. I don't have a specific problem with the recommendation, frankly, and think it seems to be fairly fiscally prudent. But as I was looking through the packet and being new to the exercise, on page 7, there are the different scenarios from previous years of what factors we use to determine the spending affordability guidelines, and sometimes it's AOB, previous year's AOB plus inflation. I think some year-over-year increase in personal income, and I am new to this exercise. I'm just curious if there should be, or why perhaps there isn't, a more standardized approach to this. If we had a set standard of the factors that we look at, and then based off of that standard approach, we then factor in some extenuating circumstance, like for instance, a federal government shutdown, which we think is going to have some type of downward impact and negative impact on potential revenues, at least for a period of time, or a potential recession, and some of the Stephen Fuller economic forecast that Mr. Sesker included in this. It was curious to me because it seems like each year many years we kind of choose different ones. Or I think there's an overarching goal of being fiscally prudent and try to reflect what the economy is doing, which I think is the right approach. But it's just curious as to why we don't have a more formulaic process.
As you noted, I think a lot of the fluctuation is based on how to make a fiscally prudent decision. And I think the reason no standard is set is because there was no standard set when the county code was adopted and the county charter was adopted. It just requested fiscal conditions. I think giving flexibility to the council to just make a decision rather than saying always inflation. What if inflation was really high and it felt like that wasn't the right decision to do at this time? Beyond that, I'd have to look more into the historical reasons why that was not set.
Yeah, if you look at the historical sort of decisions that we have made, because this issue has come up a lot, especially as people kind of come into this committee. And, basically this was always the reasoning. It was that, yes, there are a number of factors that we could look at. We could try to set some kind of very standardized way, but the notion that there are so many of those factors that constantly, vary, the idea was to also give all of us some flexibility in taking into consideration those conditions that might be so volatile in some ways. And so that's sort of, what we always felt was the best way to go. But we have had these conversations before. There have been other discussions about, taking a fresh look at some of the indicators that we do consider. And that is work that, I don't know, and Ms. Michelson maybe can update us, but that is work that we also wanted to examine as we are, have faced some very challenging times, and have wondered, why is it that we're facing this when we knew that we were looking at these particular indicators. So it is a good time to take a fresh look at this. So I would just share that, a little bit of historical.
Exactly the point I was just going to make. I think it is a good time for us to sort of re-examine our practices. I think we all agree that we can't do anything that's rigid, but perhaps there is a way to say, here are the factors that are going to be considered each year and how they're going to be considered, so it doesn't look like every year we're a totally changing direction. In this year in particular, I think the strategy that Mr. Sesker recommended is a good sense of our concern about what the next year looks like. And sometimes you can't have that reflected in a standard formula, so I would want us to continue to have flexibility. But I think as staff, we'd be open to just kind of reassessing how we do this and see if we can give you any new recommendations going forward.
Councilor Mercatz. Vice
Thank you.
President.
And I'm just going to join in what has already been said. You know, I do think we need to look at and see if we can come up with a different type of blueprint. But candidly, no blueprint is perfect. And that's part of the, I mean, if somebody can come up with a perfect formula, let's hear it. But, I mean, how could somebody predict last year what we were going to go through right now? I mean, you couldn't. And if you did, I mean, you know, you should be doing more than just this kind of work. You should be doing predictions of a lot of other things. So I think that in general, and let me just say that Jacob and Mr. Smith and everybody else has done a great job. It was more, I guess, Jacob wrote the packet rather than Gene, but I think this was really a very, very well done packet. It explained in many ways how we've been, how we've gotten here. It's never been perfect, but we've always been able to get pretty good, close on what we're doing. And then, of course, you know, it's like you say, this is not based on need. This is based on what we have. So anyhow.
Has OMB and Finance given any thought to this conversation? Because like I said, we've had, you know, these discussions in the past in terms of what should we be looking at, kind of having some different scenarios to at least go through that exercise. It may just be that, hey, what we're, you know, continuing to do should be what we continue to do, but I know that in the past we've had this conversation about looking at some other type of indicators or a combination of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of most of the forecasting that we do is very dynamic in nature, it's iterative, and it's scenario-based. So we like to assign bandwidths or probabilities for when things may occur, and that's certainly something that could be applied here. But exactly, we appreciate the flexibility and where it's not a very stringent process and timeline, because certain variables will have more implication in different years. So we try to take a holistic approach, take account of much historical information as we can, and then use that to figure out what are the most predictive variables going forward. And that's what we do with everything, and by all means could be applied here.
Councilmember Friedson, you had any other thought?
Well, I appreciate it. Again, I'm still kind of learning the process. I would be interested in seeing if we could at least think through, and I think it has been thought through quite a bit, and continuing to have that conversation. I totally appreciate the need for flexibility, and having done a little bit of this work at the state level, I mean, I can certainly appreciate that you can't ever factor in everything as my colleagues have said, but I do think that while maintaining that level of flexibility, having some more standardized approach, at least as a starting point to the conversation, might be helpful as we approach it, at least for me to think through it. But I think that the overall work here and the background setting and the kind of setting the stage for how we're approaching this was extremely helpful for me in understanding the fiscal conditions, and I think it was really good and important work, and a lot of work that has gone in from well before I got here. So I appreciate that. I did have a couple more questions, if that's okay. Somewhat related to this, but this is really just a point of clarification for me to understand. Back on page 7 from FY14 through 17, we seem to have used a similar approach where the AOB ceiling was set at the previous year's AOB plus year-over-year increase in personal income, and then it says plus any additional increases in state aid to MCPS and Montgomery College. And I was just a little confused as to what that meant. I mean, my understanding with this process is this is county taxpayer funds, and the state aid and federal aid and other fees and other revenues are added on top, and I just wasn't sure what that meant of adding it in. Do we subtract that out if we get additional state aid? Are we adding that on top, or how did that process work?
I believe what was happening during that time, because the resolution, and I should have noticed it before, whatever the council sets as the agency allocations in this process, the agency, so we'll use the schools for instance, if they set a limit for the schools based on this process, if the schools decide to exceed that limit or the executive recommends a budget above that limit, the school has to provide a letter to the council of how it would meet the AOB limit and what programs and services were impacted by that. And I believe this was a point of clarification in the council's resolution to say that any additional state aid that would come into these agencies would not count against them if they exceeded the AOB limit. Previously, the resolutions had not had that language, even though it was kind of understood in practice. So I think my understanding, and I will check with Mr. Sesker on this, is that was just point of clarification that in the resolution, any state aid that comes in that would push MCPS above,
They wouldn't have to.
they wouldn't have
send
to
the memo.
send the memo.
and- got it,
Correct. So
got it, okay.
that was, and we will get back to you on that one, but I believe that is what that letter.
Got it. Yeah, because that was my understanding. So having it written there made me feel like maybe it meant something different. And given the fact that, it's our understanding that we're going to get $19.7 million in additional state aid for schools, which is terrific news. I just didn't know if that was something that should have been factored in, or whether we should deal with it. So that I appreciate you clarifying that.
Going back to the conversation about indicators, because this is something that was, pending conversation, I think that maybe July could be a really good time for us to come back to then take a, sort of fresh look and working with Finance and OMB, because we did have conversation not just about this, but also within our fiscal plan and, and what it is that we take into consideration as we go to the rating agencies. There's always been this interest of, not necessarily because we want to change everything, but just to really take a little bit of time to, kind of brainstorm or consider, what's been happening, this whole historical data, what has been happening with that. Are there any things that maybe we do need to revisit? But I think maybe July would be a really good time after, budget and everything for us to do that, and it gives everybody ample time to think through what could be included in that. Okay?
I was just going to say, just a point of clarification, did you want to do that in council or in committee?
No, in GO.
In GO, good, thank you.
Great.
So then the committee should make a decision whether they agree with the council staff recommendation to have 1.43% for the aggregate operating budget, which is option 4 or column F in the table in circle 1.
Without objection, Councilman Richardson.
Yeah, without objection, I certainly support it. I think that it's a good recommendation. I'm just wondering if there seemed to have been some confusion with the savings plan, with the holdover money, and whether that represented a cut to schools. And when I look at the chart, I think I'm just afraid there might be some confusion that it looks like we're offering less money to public schools, which is not what we're doing here. And so I'm just wondering if it might be prudent to include a note about the 25 to 28 million that we expect to be part of the holdover money, and the 19.7 million that we expect in additional state aid. It wouldn't change the recommendation, but if we just maybe should note
to
that in the
note it,
packet
yeah.
as part of the public materials, I think maybe it would reduce some of the confusion that we had previously and avoid some of the understandable concern that folks had that there was a material change to how much we're
The
funding public
Education and Culture Committee session, when we took this up, we made sure that that was clarified. But I don't think there's ever any harm in
Yeah, I think the
doing
challenge
it as
was
much as possible.
you did a great job of making that clear, but the documents were that were public
Correct.
before that, and I think even before the committee had a chance to
Yeah.
to make that point,
yeah.
that the people had read the documents and
Right,
had jumped to
right. No, and that's why we were,
conclusions and
right,
you
that's
know,
why we were so
yeah,
careful
yeah.
at the Education Culture Committee session to clarify that, because we had already started to receive, the correspondence. And so, but to make sure that it's part of the public record in many different places, I do agree that we should definitely take
It's a good
advantage of
idea.
that. Yeah,
Staff will add that note
yeah, thank you.
for the final council packet.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so based on the aggregate operating budget, the committee will recommend to the council. Then the option 4 or column F shows you how staff would then recommend allocating those resources. And this is the kind of
Yeah.
final decision that you all need to make today that's required at least. And so for all of the non-agency allocations, we use the December update fiscal plan that provided these numbers. It meets the fiscal conditions or expectations and policies that the council has set for 10% reserve, obviously PAYCO and debt service and OPEB. For the agency allocations, and Mr. Friedson's already talked about this, we used again the fiscal plan update, which holds the college and MCPS at MOE. And then the remainder of those agencies get allocated to the county government and park and planning to hold the 0% increase over fiscal 19. So that's the staff's recommendation for how those get allocated from the aggregated operating budget that was just recommended.
All right, everybody's good, so without objection, we agree.
Great. And then the kind of final decision that has become practice during this time is setting a limit on grants or community grants in the same resolution. This isn't required in the county code under this, but again, the practice has been this. The council grants manager has recommended the same budget as last year, which is 12.2 million.
Okay, and we're just setting the total amount. I don't remember, is this when we tried in the past to specify which amount for council and executive, and then we decided that since it was a futile exercise, we just set the general amount, is that right?
This is setting the total amount, and yes, this is the time where the council would typically indicate that the expectation was a 50-50 divide between the.
Correct. But since that never happened, we then decided to just set a total amount. Nonetheless, we would like to make sure that, the administration takes that into consideration, because it is very important, and we are still doing some work, and we're going to take that up again in trying to reform the grants program for the county. There's been a lot of conversation and a lot of consultation, and work sessions were held to listen, hear from our nonprofit partners about the process, considering also perhaps migrating particular grants into the base budget, because these are grants that year after year after year have been, funded, and then it doesn't leave a lot of space within the grants program for either smaller nonprofits or innovative programs. We also had a discussion about the unified one application, and I do believe that perhaps is being done.
That's correct. There was a single application this year, as opposed to prior years when you'd apply to the executive and
Right.
then apply to the council. And we have been meeting with executive branch staff to talk about what the review process will be and where there are opportunities to coordinate that. So we're continuing to try and move ahead on some of the things the council was interested in.
Right. Ultimately, what we would really like to explore is one county grants program, because that also eliminates all the confusion and, putting additional burden on our nonprofit partners. And so we could go through an iterative process of identifying policy areas, of identifying priorities, et cetera, together, but then have one grant process. So anyway, we have to take that up. Councilmember Friedson.
Yeah, I'm interested in that process. I know that, hearing from folks in my district as I was running and since I've taken office, I know there's a tremendous amount of interest in some of those changes, and I think excitement about the work that is started in some of those conversations that are happening, because I know that it's a challenge for our nonprofit partners. And I think it's one of the things that we do best in Montgomery County is the partnerships that we have with our nonprofits to be able to support some of the social programs that we have that we wouldn't be able to do on our own, but can leverage in significant ways. And so I'm extremely interested in the results of that, and know that there are a lot of our partners who are involved in that who are even more interested and excited in it than I am. I just had a quick question. The recommendation is based this off of the amount that was appropriated last year, or the recommendation that we started with? Because
Appropriate.
the amount appropriated,
Right.
and is that what we've done in the past? Because we've, ended up with a little bit more than what we, started with in this process, which, makes sense. I just wanted to make sure that I understood that.
Sometimes that happens during our budget process, reconciliation list.
Right, right,
Yes,
right.
and in FY19, more was spent than the council
Yep.
initially anticipated or set in spending affordability guidelines, because in the end, a lot of the grant applications that came in, the council thought were so critical that they needed to be funded. And there's always a dynamic assessment based on the applications. I will note that this year we got 500 applications, which is last year I believe it was 300 something. So very dramatic growth in the number of organizations seeking assistance.
which is why we do have to, take up again, continue the work that has already taken place. I have to say that, former Councilmember Leventhal and I work very closely. And so a lot of work has taken place, but we haven't made, definite decisions, knowing that there was going to be a transition at the executive level. But it also goes to this issue of sustainability and expectation. And so, I imagine, what if we had a centralized process and one, program, but offer some flexibility so that we could leverage other funding, other foundation money or something to that effect, so that we're not in, kind of going through this process every year, which is not a very comfortable one, of having to, evaluate these extraordinary proposals, such important work, and then sit there trying to figure out, how could we somehow add a little bit more here and a little bit more there, and, oh, they need $5,000 more, $10,000 more. It's a very, I think, tedious process in terms of what the outcome should be. I think we're at a point now with the maturity of this, county and county government and the sophistication where we shouldn't be operating at that type of level. So now that we're all back and we're here together, it definitely is time to just, retake this and working in collaboration, of course, with the executive to find a much more robust way to provide that kind of support to our partners. I think the moment is right.
I look forward to it.
Councilmember Katz.
Thank you. And I agree, we need to, when we've discussed this, and I know the county executive has discussed this as well, we need to have the comprehensive change. But not only do we need to talk about the base budget, but we also need to look at multi-year grants. Our nonprofit partners having to wait till late in May or June to find out what their budget, their fiscal year is going to be in July is not fair to them, and they can't do their work. It's just not the best way to do business. So I look forward to this change, and I think it'll be a great change for really everybody involved in this.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think the other piece related to that is that because of some issues also with procurement, many not only had to wait to find out, but then did not get the money like until 6 months later. Somebody there birthed and grew a nonprofit. That's very difficult, especially if you're a small nonprofit. It's not like you have lines of credit just sitting around so you can tap into. So there are all these interesting and very important issues. But the good news, again, is that, and I have to commend Councilmember Leventhal for the work that had been done, and also as we, partner to get this going. I think we've done quite a bit already, and we can come back and tighten that up. Great. All right. So with that, any objection to the setting this?
Did we talk about the split, or how we're going to do it?
I think we're not going to do that. Yeah, we didn't do that last year because, again, it was kind of. We could include in the packet, and maybe it is, or in the resolution, that our goal or our desire, or our strong desire, is for a 50-50 split. I mean, to be fair, we do have a new administration.
Right.
So I think it would be useful
Okay,
to signal that until we finish our work in terms of the reform
correct.
for the grants process.
And as we've talked around it, just as our community partners are hearing, just to note, this is only a target. Obviously, it's like everything else in this process, once we get to the budget in May, the council can decide differently.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else, Mr. Smith?
No.
All right. Well,
As I
thank you,
tried
Ms.
to
Michelson. Thank you, everybody
Thank
coming
you.
forward. Thank you to Jake Sesker for this work.